Let's talk about jargon. A rule I try to impose upon myself is to not use jargon. When you inherit a field of knowledge, a body of knowledge, which brings order to your world, we have this flaw in human nature where we will start to speak in the jargon of that knowledge. You can see this in the red pill movement. They'll call every behavior a woman has hypergamy. Or you'll see it in the feminist movement where every evidence of suffering and injustice is called patriarchy. You'll see it with vegans, you'll see it with fitness people, you see it with carnivores, you'll see it with Christians, you'll see it with scientists who are religiously anti-religious. But what most concerns us is that you see it a lot in Jungians, sometimes at horrific levels. And as I said, this is a natural consequence of the human mind. When we're wrestling with difficult ideas, new concepts, we tend to use the ones that we have gained from whatever knowledge we are getting taught. But in order to truly demonstrate or craft your ability to understand things like this, I try to use mental tools like explaining like I'm 5, turning definitions and these type of wordy ideas into visual images. Many people often say, oh, this is right brain nonsense, but I would not consider myself someone with an incompetent left brain. I'm very good with categories. I'm very logical. I'm very straightforward in that sense. And this is more about blending the hemispheres, having them assist each other. That's how I understand it. Your left brain gets all these definitions, words, concepts, categories, if you will. And in order for you to truly gain them, to embody them, to understand them, you need to invoke your right brain and populate that category with something of your own. Richard Feynman is a famous scientist who was a great teacher, known as a great teacher. And part of his legacy was leaving behind something we call the Feynman technique, which is a way of learning things more effectively. And the way you do it is essentially this. You take some type of jargony scientific definition, and what you must do is break each and every word or concept into something that you understand almost at a childlike level. And this forces you to really reimagine what you're saying and break down what you're saying and make sense of what you're saying. And understanding this will show you why people are so bad at doing this. Because it's hard and it takes effort. It's a lot easier to just inherit the memes and spread them, propagate them like a virus with your propaganda. It takes quite a lot of effort, diligence, work, imagination to repossess these memes for yourself and to truly put them to the test. Now, with all that being said, I would like to discuss a very famous Jungian meme, which I think is very heavily misunderstood, and that would be the shadow. This, in my opinion, is the most basic and simple and useful of all of Jung's concepts. You will see elite athletes always say that they simply practice the fundamentals, and to face the shadow, as the jargon phrase goes, is the fundamental of what Jung is describing in becoming a better boyo. The prison that you live within, perhaps the reason you don't feel fulfilled, is because you are afraid of going to the place that will free you. But what you probably won't do is precisely that. You will stay trapped in your world of concepts, and it'll be a long time before you break free. And this is just the challenge of being human. But that's why the first step to all growth is facing your shadow. And that's the tough part. You will do anything to avoid facing it, including lying to yourself. At one point in my life, I was injured, and all I needed to do was humble my ass, relax, come down to earth a bit, and stop trying to lift so heavy. Stop trying to jump to the finish line. and be patient. And that would help me heal. And you know, when I started doing that, patiently building with slow progressive overload in the gym, I began to actually see results. Whereas all those times where I was just going in, trying too hard, lifting too much, I would get injured and I'd just be in this cycle of nothing, entropy. Or like with beautiful women, like I would see them as angels, as perfect. How could there be anything wrong with them? They're so beautiful. But then when you get to know them, spend some time around them, you begin to see that they're very normal. And I guess because evolutionary pressure has been so slight on them because of their beauty, they have a lot more bad habits than you'd like to confess to yourself. You learn all these things. Like behind your hate is a secret admiration. And this all comes from doing what Jung is saying. And you can pick up an eye for this stuff if you do it a lot. It gives you a way of spotting when it's happening. I guess Jung would call it shadow projection. But people throw that around because they understand the concept, but they don't really know what it means. Now, I've noticed in the community that many people project their dark side onto Nietzsche. But I just don't want to go and throw that accusation. Oh, you're all shadow projecting. We're all shadow projecting. I don't want to throw that out there because that is jargon. So I'd like to explain it. Because I sort of worry about such reactions, or I guess I see a bleakness in them. Because Nietzsche was highly skilled and he was seeking the truth. And he was far better at what he was doing than you and me. He was an extremely talented man. It's the reason why he holds his position in the canon of the West, if you will. And yet people call him dark. And that's very interesting because he's doing something you would assume is a very positive thing, seeking the truth. But he comes across as dark. So if you see Nietzsche, a truth seeker, as dark, what will you think about the truth? And it becomes even more strange for me when you see that throughout his work he is talking about celebration, about the beauty, about strength, about success, and about health, and you call it dark. Now that is, I'm sure you'll agree, suspicious. Perhaps it's because alongside this joyous wisdom that he's promoting, he voices all the dark ideas that you don't want to be true, that deep down you know needs to be explored. Because strength, beauty, success, health often come at the expense of other things. We've discussed this with food, for example. Your vitality, your thriving health is premised on the death of lower creatures. And perhaps even if you're vegan, you've got to confess that you have to eat something that is alive. Now, I know you try and mitigate by not eating the most living animals like cows or pigs, but plants struggle for survival just the same. And a little reality like this is so savage that we will pretend it's not true because we cannot face it. Because we're cowards. Because we're afraid that if we enslave animals and think it's right, perhaps the people who enslave us aren't exactly wrong. And that's where the darkness comes in. Just like when Nietzsche suggests that the people who are suffering in life may largely be at fault for their own suffering due to incompetence. Or that the weak people, those who suffer, are actually far more hateful than the strong people. Watch any woman. She is disgusted by the weak man. He is a creep. Her instincts know his smiling face is hiding his true desire, a desire he's too afraid to reveal. And and that runs up her spine like a creepy feeling. But you dismiss this stuff. You dismiss this as immoral and wrong, incorrect, monstrous way to think, even though it's simply an observation of the behavior that you do. Because you can't handle it. Probably because part of you is that weakness that he's speaking to. And maybe the way Nietzsche is trying to save you is by helping you identify this weakness so that you can crush it and become strong. But like we said with all shadow work, someone can give you the answer, but because you're so afraid of it, you will do anything to avoid even looking at it, including lying to yourself, including looking at the person telling you and saying, "What a monster." Nietzsche said that the strength of your spirit is measured by how much truth you can digest, and digest was a very important word there. Because all the above is truth that is hard to digest. It's indigestible. It makes you a little bit sick. It grates on your soft, jelly-like inner belly. And so what happens is you don't eat it. You shove it into your unconscious. You bury it somewhere else where it rots and it turns sour, and like a corpse, it darkens. And so when someone comes across Nietzsche and he's painting all these really harsh truths, these indigestible truths, they are literally facing in him all those scary things and those evil things that they have buried away in the back of their mind. I've noticed this strange pattern where people look at his death and feel that he got taken by some type of spiritual force for all these thoughts that he have. Like he was taken down into hell for saying such horrible things. And that's very interesting because Jung said that the unconscious, the deep, is where the shadow lurks. Down in the unconscious, in the deep, in Hades, is where we bury the things we don't want to face. The Greeks used to say Hades was full of shades. And so when people meet Nietzsche as a representation of these ideas, the indigestible truths that they haven't confronted, they start to get these forlorn feelings like he needs to be saved, like he's a tragic figure that needs redemption, like there's something wrong with what he did. This is the most liked comment on that Red Book video myself and Jimmy did. Jung is an astronaut of the cosmic unconscious, as was Nietzsche. Unfortunately, Nietzsche never returned. And I find that fascinating because on an individual level, we all must go into Hades, like Orpheus did, and save the truth and bring it back up to the surface, bring it back up to consciousness. We must go down to the world of shades and bring consciousness back up. And there does seem to be this mini myth surrounding Nietzsche, where it's him that is trapped at the bottom. And what we're saying is we need to save him. But I wonder, is it him being used as a symbol? I'm sort of doing a bit of group psychotherapy here, so forgive me. But are we looking at him and projecting on him the idea that we need to resurrect our shadow into consciousness because he represents our intellectual shadow? We project onto him a dream where we need to resurrect Nietzsche from hell because we somehow understand deeply that that's what we should be doing. I dare say we're not protecting ourselves from the indigestible truth which Nietzsche confronted by suggesting that he got taken by some evil spirit into hell. I hope that's not what we're doing. I hope we're not suggesting that his quote-unquote darkness makes what he says wrong Because what could we fault him on? He pursued the truth more religiously, more Christ-like than you did. He understood that we want our moral principles to be strong. He understood that we want our worldview to be reliable. All army generals know that conjecture or sloppiness gets people killed, so we, warriors of the soul, we are building something that is resistant to the onslaught of modernity, the onslaught of science. And if we are to do this properly, we have to give our moral principles hell. And so when Jordan Peterson says, rescue your father from the belly of the whale, we do lean a bit on that jargon problem again, because what he is saying is precisely this. We must save our father from hell. We must go into the belly of the beast and grab the indigestible truth and bring it up. We must get Nietzsche and save him. We must discover the values that made our father a man and resurrect them so they can make us a man. And tell me, is that any different than finding God? Discovering the values that have made every great man a man. I try to understand this through the metaphor of music. Music has laws of harmony which are rock solid. People will say, oh no, you can break the laws of harmony. But yes, of course you can break the laws of harmony, but no one's going to listen to your music when you do it. Modern aharmonic music is incredibly unpopular and essentially just a circle jerk for a load of academics who have nothing better to do. The laws of harmony create beauty, order, justice within music. And each genre of music obeys these eternal laws. And each genre has to go through the journey of this rediscovering these eternal laws for itself. And so through each genre of music, you're seeing a new perspective on something that is eternal at bottom. These deep laws. And likewise in the life of a man, as I said, his father was shaped by these same laws of life and came up with a certain style of life. But then the young man must discover how he can find those same laws and create his own style of life. And all men have been through this. And like men, we see the same with ages. There are principles that hold nations, empires, societies together. If you see societies as a song, deep at their root, there is a harmony, and all of the societies generally obey them. Each society is like a genre with its own take. Greco-Roman culture had its polytheistic take. China and Japan had their way of finding these same principles and creating an incredibly rich history separate to our own. Christian Europe did just the same. Through Christianity, accessed these eternal, deep rules that carried Europe through the last 2,000 years. And Nietzsche, being so cognizant of this process, paid particular attention to where we sat in relation to our lens into the eternal rules. Music genres go through this sort of life cycle. Rock and roll was really big, and when it rose up with its particular take on harmony and musicality, it was swaggering, proud, powerful, Led Zeppelin-like. And then during the 80s, it just got ridiculous, almost classical music level, and some of the stuff that the guitar soloists were doing. And then after a while, the indulgence, the mastery of the rules grew old, and you saw someone like Kurt Cobain show up who was using chunky basic power chords, and everything got a lot more simpler and more bleak. And then suddenly they started wearing shirts saying rock is dead. And nowadays rock is a sideline genre compared to the recently risen hip-hop, which has its own take on the laws of music, just like anything else. And this death of a genre can be quite tragic, especially if you were, some famous rock star. To see your genre become obsolete is a horrible feeling, because it's still great. It obeys the eternal rules. But the way that it looks at them, the style, is dead. And you sort of feel dead with it, and everybody's moved on to something else, and you don't quite get it. You sort of see it, but you just don't quite vibe with it. You might even hate it. Classical musicians thought rock music was this unharmonic, monstrous mess. Rock musicians listened to hip-hop and said there's literally no instruments. But they all obey the same rules. If you study this stuff, they will be there. Now, what becomes interesting is when we take this metaphor and paint it over societies. We know that some of the earliest civilized people were farmers, eating grain, who had a particular worldview that might have had a mother goddess at the center of it. And these people, with their religion, with their take on these eternal principles, kept them together. But then, of course, the herding, meat-eating, milk-drinking Indo-Europeans come in their chariots, bringing a new type of God, a new religion that gives them access to the eternal principles, and they conquer, take over, and establish their own take, a new genre. They make classical music not cool anymore. And the absolute apotheosis of their culture appears in the Roman Empire. And just as the Roman Empire is going through its 80s moment, Christianity shows up with a new way to access these eternal principles. And it swoops in and takes over Rome and makes all their gods uncool. Now, what Nietzsche noticed about the transition between these gods is that there was a lot of bloodshed. The Indo-Europeans spilt blood. The Christians killed many pagans. Whereas in the music scene, you might get a couple of snarky comments on YouTube. In a real life, or shall we say, the big boy world of religious superorder societies, you're talking blood. And so when Nietzsche said, God is dead, and the consequences of this will see rivers full of blood run, this is precisely what he meant. The Christian age had reached a point where it had become uncool, and the European people were trying to find a new way to get in touch with the eternal principles. To resurrect the Father from the belly of the whale, if you will. Perhaps in some sense, to metaphorically resurrect God. And now, to properly conceptualize this, just think about Rome. Rome had access to eternal principles of harmony, of truth, of order, VERITAS. They had all these ideas about how to stabilize and hold together a society with a moral order. And they did this in a polytheistic way. But its weakness was it was supremacist, aimed at the Indo-European conquerors, the Romans. The citizens of Rome were the people who had the privilege of access to the gods. Now, this is not a very effective way to rule a state when you have an appetite for slaves. And so the slaves turned to a religion that gave them dignity. And that was Christianity. And so this Achilles heel brought the Roman pantheon down. And then Christianity, with its monotheism, created a new genre, a new perspective, a new lens with which we can use to access the eternal principles. Order, truth, harmony, justice, purpose, fulfillment. These things were all present, just the same, but this time they were jam-packed into one symbol: God. Now, this was a great strength because through this very simple process of worshipping one God, you got access to truth, harmony, order, beauty, all the values. He was the goodness of the world. But there was a vulnerability, and Nietzsche talks about it. Christianity is a system, a view of things that is conceived as a connected whole. If you break off a major concept from it, faith in God, you break up the whole as well. There are no necessities left to hold on to anymore. It is true as long as God is truth. It stands and falls with faith in God. And so a very important trait of the Christian God is that he gave you logos. He gave you this logical faculty, this reason, if you will. Now, this was a very big problem because this logos, this reason, being so valuable, being the tool God wielded to shape the world, and the way that he placed it in you so that you could be his extended hand in shaping the world, led to the Europeans cultivating this logos, this reason, as the prime ideal. And so they became more reasonable, more logical, more rational. This tool got better and better, sharper and sharper, until it formed into science. And then it did the absolute unthinkable. Then it turned around and started asking reasonable, rational, logical questions about God. Copernicus, wielding this logos, discovers that heaven is not quite what we thought it was. Darwin, just the same, makes some insights into our origin. And soon we take this logos, this sword, and we start poking at God, thinking he's invincible, the absolute representation of truth. And lo and behold, our prods draw blood, and he falls and dies. And suddenly the sky is black, and we no longer have him. Rock is suddenly not in fashion anymore. And suddenly everybody gets very anxious because we know that blood is about to spill. And furthermore, people like Nietzsche know that we are in a desperate situation until we resurrect this dead God that we have killed and put something in his place. Because without God as this lens, as this portal into the eternal laws and principles that hold up all societies and give people purpose, truth, justice and meaning, we are going to fall into chaos. We are going to start playing free jazz, and free jazz is very shit. And so that's what he meant when he was saying, what sacred games must we invent? How are we going to wipe up all this blood? In order for us to get over this blip in history, this chasm that we need to cross, we need to resurrect something. And that is no simple task. And you can see how we have failed to do this. The new atheist movement, atheism in general, is a brilliant example of this. Atheism is an astounding position to take because it is completely reactive and completely almost teenage in the sense that it has no originality to it at all. It is completely premised on the Christian frame. All they're saying is that there is no God. They're not making any assertions about reality at all. Nietzsche, for example, or maybe my spin on Nietzsche, frames it more like there are eternal principles, and each god or each religious system you lift up out of those eternal principles becomes like this genre, this symbol that carries you through, that acts as a portal, and when you lose that symbol, you're in a terrible place. But the principles remain the same, and you can still find them in any age and any time. They're always there, and you can find them in any way if you go deep enough. So all a atheist does is just say, no God. They don't ever start to deal with the problem, which is, yes, perhaps the way we understood God before is outdated, but we still need the eternal principles. Without the eternal principles of justice, order, truth, harmony, everything falls apart and turns into anarchy, and not the sexy movie style anarchy, The anarchy of Soviet Russia, where all your words stop meaning anything, and at any moment there could be a government informant in your friend circle that will send you to the gulag. You could say moral anarchy, which would wear away such a society until it collapses like the Soviet Union did. And so yes, the atheists steal Nietzsche's thunder and come announcing this new order, but they're no men to follow. They're not correct, nor are they even great at thinking about this problem. The best way I could describe them is people who lack imagination. You could even say that they got so caught up in the jargon of Christianity that they can't even break their minds free from the very prison they're trying to destroy. And so what I believe Nietzsche is asserting is that now that our image of God, our dream, our conception of God, our portal into the eternal principles has died, has fallen, has went into the underworld, what we need to do is resurrect it by creating a new conception, an update. And so what we are waiting on are the great people of imagination, the artists. This is what Nietzsche calls the philosopher of the future. Because the failure of our storytellers, and it is most certainly their responsibility, means that most people will lose touch with the eternal values. And that's why you see religions as far more functional and far more benevolent for people's mental health than some nonsense some new atheist spouts. Because even though it may be outdated and they don't actually believe it, it brings them back in touch with the eternal principles. And you can see why Jordan Peterson has had so much success, because he is doing that. He is providing us a portal back into these ancient stories. And so I'm going to discuss how Nietzsche saw this and how he saw the possibility of a resurrection, of a new conception of God. Now, to premise this, there's a very important distinction that we are making here. And that is the difference between the dream we have of God, you know, the bearded man in the sky, or the Romans before, similar bearded man in the sky type of idea, and the reality of these eternal principles that this symbol becomes a portal to, you know. Like through going to church, through focusing on God, through praying to God, you get in touch with truth, harmony, justice, and all these things. But these things are jargon. They're very, very hard to visualize. And so what we do is we gift people a symbol to help them with that. And what's interesting is that these things, truth, harmony, justice, are so real, like the laws of music, that they're rock solid, always there, ever present in every civilization that we look into. And so in some sense, you could say that God is real. Just the problem is when you use that word, it's loaded with jargon, and you're just an infallible human that probably doesn't know what that means. So you sound like a brainwashed derp. And you've moved past the age where you can use that word without qualifying it properly. And I'm sorry, don't blame me. That's just the way it is. And so God now is a tough word to use. But these eternal principles, I don't think anybody would disagree with them. They are there. I think the evidence proves that they are there. And so these things are so deep, so foundational, that we could look at them as the creators, as God, as the fingerprints of God, if you will, whatever way you want to conceptualize them. I guess our problem is we need to conceptualize them in a way that resonates with everybody, and I'm sure that will be coming soon. I kind of feel it, I guess. Or maybe I'm going crazy, who knows. But that is an important thing to understand, is that these ordered principles exist, and you could say that they were put there by an almighty creator. It's very hard to know. But what's most important, what people need, I find psychologically, is something they can put their faith into that will deliver results in the world, that will deliver positive results in the world. That's what they say about God, is put your faith in God and everything will work out to the plan. And you know, if you struggle with this, if you were a hardline rationalist like myself, I don't think this is a floozy concept to say there are eternal principles that hold the world together, and they've been ever present, almost to a godlike level among all societies, and you can access them through any lens you wish, and if you put your faith in them, you will make the world a better place. And I think that's good enough to get people going, you know? So that's something to think about and to hold in mind, that in some sense we're not necessarily changing the fundamentals, but we're reimagining how we interact with them, because that's what we've lost. The postmodern age was this declaration that there are no fundamentals, that free jazz is justified, but it's not. All your instincts know it's not, and this is starting to get exposed. It's just ridiculous at this point. And the values that come from this are very fascinating, because people have built values upon this worldview. There are no eternal ideas, but then there are, of course, religious values. And Nietzsche noted this. He said that though Europe is losing contact with religion, it's becoming more religious. Only our religion is centered a lot more on equality than justice. And I don't think I've ever seen a society hold equality as its prime value. Fairness, equality before the law, equality of opportunity, these were all known as justice. What the very strange interpretation of this that we see today, you could say the toxic expression of that eternal value, may ruin us, because that was the twisted value that the Soviet Union was premised on. And the Soviet Union declared itself an atheist state. And I think the gig is up. We're not looking for atheists. We're looking for creators to bring us a new vision that gets us back in touch with these deep cardinal principles. And perhaps it will come in the form of a redemption of the old stories, similar to what Jordan Peterson seems to have been doing. And perhaps you could suggest that that's what Carl Jung figured out as well. But I'm interested in seeing how Nietzsche specifically said it has to go down, and what he meant by his reevaluation of all values. Now, I notice the jargon surrounding this is most people think, oh, well, Jung said Nietzsche did something that's impossible to do, and Jordan Peterson promotes this as well. Oh, Nietzsche said that you should reevaluate all values, but, you know, Jung said you can't do that and all that. And that's very interesting, because who said Jung is the final authority on this? When I hear this, I hear a refusal to think for yourself. And so even though Nietzsche died, or if you will, got taken down to hell before he could do his reevaluation of all values. And bear in mind, he said, I know this needs to be done, and I don't see anybody else capable of doing it. Perhaps I'll have to do it myself. And so even though he died early, you can see the kernels of his thinking in this direction throughout his work. And so in order to understand this, we need to run through his understanding of the individual, because how the individual relates to the world determines vastly what the meaning of a God is. Now, Christianity has taught us that each of us have a soul, and the concept of the soul is a very specific concept. You could call it a jargon. Now, Nietzsche, trying to break free of this jargon, did philology. He would study the evolution of such a notion throughout history. And this study is fascinating. You probably remember in the Bible, Adam is given life through the breath of God. Now, the notion of having life, to be alive, is very close to the idea of breath. And these very physical origins inform our more spiritual notions that come later. The English word spirit comes from the Latin spiritus, which means breath, courage, and vigor. You've probably heard the word inspiration, and that's where you get that idea of energy, vigor. And what happens when you breathe deeply? I'm sure you've all done Wim Hof, where you suck in all that air and you get a buzz off it. That type of idea. Breath is life. Breath is to live. Breath is to have consciousness. When you stop breathing, when your pulse goes, your soul, your mind, your consciousness, what people would have recognized in the past as a being, a creature, living, would have gone. And many ancient cultures saw the last breath to leave your mouth as your spirit finally escaping your body. That's when the completed cycle of life is over, and the thing that possessed you, that turned you from inanimate matter into a living, moving thing, had left. And so you've probably heard the word pneumatic before, beginning with a P, P-N-E-U-M-A-T-I-C, I think it is. A pneumatic drill that uses air. And that's where you get that same idea, pneuma, breath, spirit. That's a root of the idea of psyche, which of course you'll know from psychology, which means soul, where you're starting to see how all this stuff ties together, because the breath is the fundamental foundational idea of the mind. And this all ties back to that old Indo-European stuff, where you're getting the idea of the breath coming from a P word, psyche, or something like this. Now, what this breath does is it animates you. It fills you full of energy. And animating isn't a super important word because it comes from Latin. It comes from the idea of animus. And this idea, to be animated, to be animus, is the foundation of the idea of the modern soul. This is what the Romans saw as the soul. When you were full of breath, when you were inspired, you were full of energy, you were moving, that meant you had a soul. That means the soul lived in you. The animus lived in you. And so this idea evolved eventually into the notion of the rational mind, the intellect, the consciousness, the higher noble sort of logos principles of later. But you can see the root was very, very basic in the idea of motivation, inspiration, will, intention, courage. Now, we've talked in previous lectures about the Roman notion of virility, masculinity, and courage, because what they see as the prime value would be something like courage, battle courage, if you will. And so the animus was this energy. And this is where Jung got his idea of animus and anima. He saw this Latin word and he used them because they represent that type of idea. And so this breath creates life, and the Romans saw this animus as this sort of higher dominating spirit, if you will. It's it's life as such, you know, the animating force, if you will. Life versus the inanimate world, which is death. And so Nietzsche had this notion of the will to power. This will to power was the intention of life, the fact that everything that lives is seeking to grow, to take up more space, to conquer, to be bigger, to be better, to thrive. Darwin says the will to survive, but Nietzsche sort of asserts a more positive thing. Everything wants to feel inspired, healthy, strong, indomitable. And so the Romans would have centered their understanding of what it meant to be a person on this animus. You could become, in some sense, more of a person by being more animus, having more life, having more animation about them. And this, of course, was rooted in the very ancient physical understanding of life and death. To breathe is to live, to stop breathing is to die. And so if you are inspired, full of life, full of energy, full of vital courage, power, inspiration, you are in many senses more alive. And it's a much more passionate understanding, far more Italian. It seems like those Romans have not changed. And so this route is, of course, fascinating because it is much more in line with what we understood as what we understand as Nietzsche's will to power. And our understanding of the soul has changed quite a lot. The Romans would have considered this their soul. And this is so much more interesting when you look at the idea of like inertia. Inertia is related to the idea of cowardice. Now, we understand inertia as not moving, but they understand inertia as the fear, the juxtaposition to the word courage. And so animus is movement, life is movement, living is movement, thriving is movement. And inertia is cowardice, death, inanimation. And so when you are inert, you lack a soul in some sense. And I got a lot of this from Caroline Barton, who's very, very interesting. She saw that the way Romans understood status, reputation, honor, the way they would understand a moral person, and that's not a very good word to use this, the way they would look at an honorable and respectful person, a person of good character, the way we nowadays would look at someone who's, you know, gives a lot to the poor. Oh, they're very moral, they're very honorable. The way they saw that is someone who would manifest this animus, this inspiration, and contribute it to the world in a powerful way, in a will to power way, you know, create a great work, win in a battle, do a great speech, overcome a great obstacle, bravery, courage, creativity, the creative spirit, to unleash life, especially in a sort of civilized way, was what earned you honor. And so honor was something that you sort of gained. And what's interesting is the idea of man, even humanness, was something rare. You could be born male, but that does not mean you're going to be born a man. A man is something you create. Vir, as they called it, where we get the word virility. To become a man, to become a vir, was like an initiation you must go through. That initiation was confronting fear, you know, going into a battle and bravely fighting the enemy. That was enough to turn you into a man. And that was the idea of honor. To be a vir is incredibly honorable. And that's an indication of you're a good character. You've found the eternal principles and embodied them. You've gone down and discovered courage, justice, truth, harmony with yourself and brought it into the world. And so in some sense you built yourself in ancient Roman society. Now, what's interesting about this is all these words, this idea of animation, of animus, of what you are, is a lot different from the way we understand things, but still rooted in this. Because the Romans had a word called genius, and genius is related to the idea of Geist or ghost, as we understand it. Genius is related, is sourced in that idea that people would have noticed when you breathe, you have a mind, you have a consciousness, you have an awareness, you exist. And when you stop breathing, it's gone. And so when you breathe, you get inspired, you get powered to release what you are, if you will. When you breathe, your personality starts to shine through. When you have animation, your personality starts to shine through. And this would be your genius, your spirit, if you will, like the way we understand it now. But they would call it their genius. Obviously, this word has turned into this idea of dazzling, super genius scientist or musician or something like that, super smart. But it was more about personality and style, that type of idea. And everything had a genius, you know, everything had a character to it, if you will. And this isn't far from the way they understood this. And this actually is related to the idea of gene. It comes from the Indo-European word gene, I think it is, where it's give birth, produce, generate. Think of that idea. And so a genus is a group of animals in biology. It's also a tribe of people. And so it's that type of notion that, you know, you get a man and he procreates and has many children and makes a tribe. And what you will have is you'll have this sort of genius, this sort of common character among all these people. The Irish have a very specific genius, you know. They're very good at poetry and very good at drinking alcohol, like that type of blend. And so the Germans, you know, they've got a very famous genius. The French, They've all got these separate geniuses. And this comes from this united spirit that comes out of this race or clan or group. And of course, it can descend down into everything. Like this was probably rooted in the ancient animated religions, where they saw like rocks and stuff having it. And that's why the Roman polytheism, this is the foundational idea of the Roman polytheism, is that everything has a character and you can abstract these characters. So when you come in contact with truth, you're meeting the genius of truth, which is VERITAS, as they understood it. That was the goddess. And when you come in contact with a virile male, you're meeting virility there, the genius that possesses all of those virile males, this sort of disembodied God that they talked about. And so this becomes very interesting, because this idea of genius is what the Christians took and turned into the idea of soul. Augustine equated the Christian soul with the Roman genius. And so you've gotten this logos idea, and this is where it started to evolve more into dazzling intellect. But you can see that it was not rooted in that. It was something much different. It was the character, the personality, the spirit of a thing or a group. Most specifically a group, because this is where we start to see the relationship between the individual and God. Just like you saw those virile, courageous men, you would see this sort of spirit, this Geist, this genius hanging over all of them, which would be virility, the god of virility. A people would have a genius hanging over them. The Romans would have Jupiter. The Jews had Yahweh. And each feeling of inspiration, of life, of energy they felt would be connected to this symbol. And this is where you see the creation of God. God would fill them with energy to go fight the enemy. God, as this giant collective symbol for their minds, would help them make decisions and understand what to do. It would give them this way to unify their identity and understand themselves as all working towards the same goal. And as I said before, this God, this genius, was their way, their unique, personal genre that brought them in touch with the eternal principles that held everything together. And so the way the ancient world used to work is when another tribe conquered a race or a clan, what would happen is the conquered race would forget all their gods, would give up all their gods in a confession that this other tribe's gods were superior. They were a better genre. When someone came dashing in with rock into classical music world or jazz music world or hip hop world and destroyed them, wiped them out, destroyed their cities, they would start worshipping all these new gods, because these new gods were a better conception that seemed to bring them in touch with the principles that made them stronger, and therefore that's why they were victorious. Now that's an astounding way to think about this. It shows that there was this sort of spiritual warfare going on, and it was like a war of dreams, perhaps a very early form of psychological warfare, where the people who were subjugated would in part accept this, but I guess they didn't really have any choice. Now, something to note about the Romans that is very interesting is that when they conquered races, they often allowed them to keep their gods, and they do this sort of quite modern comparative mythology strategy where they would try to understand the native or this clan's gods and compared to the Roman gods. So for example, they were fighting against the Germans and they called Odin Mercury, Odin being their chief god. So they thought, oh, those guys worship Mercury, that's super interesting. And when they took over the Jews, they have some famous passages where they're given out being like, what's going on with these dudes? They worship like the opposite of what we worship. They're practically atheists. They had a very hard time understanding what the hell was going on with the Jewish God. And there's a very important reason for this. If you read your Bible history, you will discover that the first establishment of the great empire of Israel was an extremely rich and powerful empire. But like all rich empires, Rome, the modern empire, they got decadent. They got into being immoral. They lost touch with the eternal values. And so God sent the Assyrians. Or a better way to understand it is that they got soft and the barbarians at the gates came in and smashed them. Now, of course, when you get smashed, traditionally you would sacrifice your gods and start worshipping new gods. But that's not what happened in the case of Israel and the Judeans. Though the Israelis lost their identity, the people remaining in Judah held on to Yahweh. And Nietzsche talks about the consequences of this very interesting behavior. Originally, and above all in the time of the monarchy, Israel maintained the right attitude of things, which is to say the natural attitude. Its Yahweh was an expression of its consciousness of power, its joy in itself, its hopes for itself. To him the Jews looked for victory and salvation, and through him they expected nature to give them whatever was necessary for their existence. Above all, rain. Yahweh is the God of Israel, and consequently the God of justice. This is the logic of every race that has power in its hands and a good conscience in the use of it. You see the evidence of this in the religious ceremony of the Jews. Their nation is grateful for the high destiny that has enabled it to obtain dominion. It is grateful for the benign procession of the seasons, for the good fortune attending its herds and its crops. This view of things remains an ideal for a long time, even after it has been robbed of its validity by tragic blows, by the anarchy within, by the Assyrian without. But the people still retained, as a projection of their highest yearnings, the vision of a king who was a gallant warrior and an upright judge. A vision best dreamed by the typical prophet, Isaiah. But all of these hopes remained unfulfilled. The old God could no longer do what he used to do. He ought to have been abandoned. But what actually happened? Simply this. The conception of him was changed. The conception of him was denaturalized. This was the price that had to be paid to keep him. And so, through studying the Bible, we can see this very, very common process of a God rising up, empowering a people, and then falling, happening. And it gives us the power to react to this. This is why understanding the Bible is actually super important, even if you're some type of mad atheist or something like that. If you don't get this, you're no use. You're no genius. You haven't figured nothing out. And so Nietzsche's pointing now here that they didn't give up on Yahweh. And so Yahweh started to morph. Just like the genius, the personality, the character of a people when they are proud and full of energy and boastful will take on that sort of look when they started to become a slave people, a ruled people. Then this God started to morph into their sadness, their yearning, their hope. And instead of boasting about their power like it would have done when it was on top of the world, when Israel was ruled by Solomon, the richest man on earth at that time, this Geist, this spirit, this genius starts to speak differently to the people and starts to say, I still love you even though you suffer. And it starts to change its attitude. And so Nietzsche notes this is somewhat of a pattern, and we are currently at the late stages of one of these patterns. And he describes how we should understand gods so that we can have a better understanding of our situation. A criticism of the Christian concept of God leads inevitably to the same conclusion. A nation that still believes in itself holds fast to its own God. In him it does honor to the conditions which enable it to survive, to its virtues. It projects its joy in itself, its feeling of power, into a being to whom one may offer thanks. He who is rich will give of his riches. A proud people need a God to whom they can make sacrifice. Religion within these limits is a form of gratitude. A man is grateful for his own existence. To that end, he needs a God. Such a God must be able to work both benefits and injuries. He must be able to play either friend or foe. He is wondered at for the good he does, as well as for the evil he does. But the castration against all nature of such a God, making him a God of goodness alone, would be contrary to human inclination. Mankind has just as much need for an evil God as for a good God. It doesn't have to thank mere tolerance and humanitarianism for its own existence. What would be the value of a God who knew nothing of anger, revenge, envy, scorn, cunning, violence? Who had never perhaps experienced the rapturous ardours of victory and destruction? No one would understand such a God. Why should anyone want him? When a nation is on the downward path, when it feels its belief in its own future, its hope of freedom slipping from it, when it begins to see submission as the first necessity and the virtues of submission as measures of self-preservation, then it must overhaul its God. But when they don't, he becomes a hypocrite. Timorous and demure, he counsels peace of soul, hate no more, leniency, love of friend and foe. He moralizes endlessly. He creeps into every private virtue. He becomes the God of every man. He becomes the private citizen, a cosmopolitan. Formerly he represented a people, the strength of a people, everything aggressive and thirsty for power in the soul of a people. Now he is simply the good God. The truth is that there is no other alternative for gods. Either they are the will to power, in which case they are national gods, or incapacity for power, in which case they have to be good. And that's Nietzsche at his best there, really punching you in the stomach with your notions of goodness and all that stuff. But you can see what he is saying is fascinating, because it's exactly where we find ourselves. We had that swagger, we had that boastfulness in Europe when they went out colonizing the world, and they were Christian, but it was a sort of special interpretation of Christian, where they were allowed, bring Christianity to the world, spread the good news as they were at the edge of a musket, at a bayonet, with cannons, with ships. And now we're reaching this point where a lot of that has started to stale, and of course God has died, and our image of that has died, and our portal to the eternal values that motivated them to create that great world empire is now pitter-pattering out. And you can see all the things Nietzsche was describing are starting to flood back in: the cosmopolitanism, the timidness, the sort of death of the European soul. Just like the Jews went through a crisis when Yahweh failed them, so the Europeans are going through something extremely similar right now. And they most certainly are at breaking point. And now a very interesting thing for me is how Nietzsche says at the end, the national God is the only correct way to conceptualize a God. Because he is trying to solve this problem. He's like, we need to reconceptualize God. And Yahweh was a big beast, a God of justice and power in the past, so it's not totally against the rules either. But the thing is, when he says national, he doesn't mean what you probably think he means. He means a lot more to do with the root of the idea of national, which is natal, which is nativity play, which is birth. Antinatalism, you've probably heard of. It's that type of root word. And so what we are talking about here is the notion of the Roman genius, the deification of the spirit of a people, of the energy of a people, of the character of a people, of the soul of a people. And so you start to see the way Nietzsche was looking to re-evaluate all morals. And he wanted to start with the remoralization of the individual. He wanted to start with the re-inspiration, the revitalization, the rebirth of the energy of the people. And you know, what's interesting about the Christian God during the peak of the Christian era is that this God backed the monarchies, he backed the hierarchy, and then that all fell, and we found ourselves in the eon of democracy. And people love this. They're like, oh, democracy, equal rights and all that stuff. And yes, it is equal rights, and that's fantastic, but it's also equal responsibility. To live in a democratic society, to wield the will of a people as a leading force, is a great burden on the people, because democracy is sort of one of those things where you're only as strong as your weakest link. And so a big question that seems to be getting asked by Nietzsche is, how do we remoralize the people so that the God we create is good enough to take us to the eternal values? These are the civilization building values. The value of justice, the value of harmony, order, and truth. The values that all genres have drawn from. And Nietzsche, being a staunch reductionist, suggests that the first order principle that will go into this remoralization, re-inspiration of the people so that God can be reborn for the future will come in a very physical way. Here's a quote. Wherever the will to power begins to decline, in whatever form, there is always an accompanying decline physiologically, a decadence. The divinity of this decadence, shorn of its masculine virtues and passions, is converted perforce into a god of the physiologically degraded, of the weak. Of course, they do not call themselves the weak, they call themselves the good. And so Nietzsche is suggesting a cult of health as a first principle. He's pretty much saying, go to the gym and it'll all work out, bro. And you know, there is wisdom to that. And I guess the most fundamental wisdom is that much of the eternal values have nothing to do with your suffering. The eternal values of justice, of truth, of high art, of creative achievement, of success and ambitious projects, like that has nothing to do with making you feel better, you know, stopping your suffering from hurting you. To find the truth, as we discussed at the very start, to confront your shadow is horrible and painful and difficult. Your suffering is actually like something you have to beat. You have to go through the suffering and tell yourself, get over it, you little wimp. That's the attitude you need to have. And so to pedestalize suffering is sort of a lie, a betrayal of these eternal values of God. The almighty creator surely had to labor to set up this game of Minecraft we all call life. And so why would you be any different? And in this we see the core of Nietzsche's notion of how to reevaluate all values. And it all revolves around suffering. The problem of suffering is just such a huge religious problem. It's so psychologically potent for humans, because being in pain and gaining pleasure, these things are a big deal to us. And I'm sure you know, I'm no better. We love pleasure. I hate pain. Like, I'm no different than anyone else. We treat them religiously, and so our attitude towards them religiously must be correct. We must contextualize them properly. And Nietzsche has a brilliant quote from Beyond Good and Evil that describes his problem with this. Whether it be hedonism, pessimism, utilitarianism, or eudaimonianism, all these modes of thinking which measure the worth of things according to pleasure and pain, that is, according to accompanying circumstances and secondary considerations, are plausible modes of thought and naiveties, which everyone conscious of creative powers and in possession of an artist's conscience, will look down upon with scorn, though not without sympathy. And so through this you begin to see his understanding of what God is, his understanding of the problem we have with our relationship to God. And of course everybody always talks, oh, God is dead. And yes, Nietzsche was the man who coined that, and it is important to really get what that particular man is saying about this problem. It requires a reconception, an artistic rebirth. It requires us to stop using the jargon we used in the past and reconceptualize something that is always there, that is eternal, that, if you will, is divine in its everlasting ability to nourish the societies that hold the principles sacred. And so the beginning of his suggestion on how to do this was about physiological strength, but it also came to a mental strength, the strength to aim high and aim big and aim bombastic, to look at the chaos that we find ourselves in, the postmodern conundrum, and decide assertively, this is the world I want to bring into being. A world where there is abundant health and joy and beauty, and as a consequence, happiness. And all of this is predicated on the virile masculine virtues that are eternal throughout all great cultures, which allow mankind to assert great ambitions, hopes and values based on justice, truth and power, which all get channeled into a symbol, a potent, centralized place that they can focus all this energy, a symbol which takes the form of a masculine God, who then breeds back into them the inspiration that gets them up off their arse to get out there and go for it.